All right, everybody, we're continuing here in Chapter 7. We're going to begin with slide number 47 in the PowerPoint. We're talking about the North American Free Trade Agreement. Again, we're still talking about regional integration. And again, the lowest on the hierarchy is a free trade agreement. This went into effect between the United States, Mexico, and Canada in 1994. It was very controversial. Again, why was it controversial? The argument was are American businesses going to offshore to Mexico, maybe Canada, but probably Mexico because it's cheaper to do business there. It's cheaper to produce products there. In fact, the textbook references Ross Perot, the 1992 presidential candidate, and he says, listen, have you heard that large sucking sound? It's basically all of the businesses being sucked down into Mexico. Okay, and you can see where the alarm for NAFTA was legitimated by what actually happened in 1992. The United States had a $1.7 billion trade surplus with Mexico. By 2013, it had a $54 billion trade deficit. So obviously a lot of the concern happened. In other words, a lot of the businesses did go over there. So the Trump administration attempted to modify that in 2018, and it's still being kind of rectified there, but you're welcome to look at the YouTube clip there that talks about it. Moving on here on slide number 48, globalization. Again, the idea that we're integrated and we're interdependent basically among nations in our economies, in our societies, in our cultures. The process by which human interconnectedness is reaching generally a global level. You know, obviously with this coronavirus, you can see where globalization, this is the downside of it. I've said this in my American national government classes about how the American economy tends to affect the rest of the world. And I've often said, listen, when America catches a cold, the rest of the world sneezes. The reverse of this has been true with this coronavirus. When China catches a cold, the rest of the world sneezes. In other words, you've got global travel. You've got the interconnectedness of businesses. You've got American companies doing business in China and all over the world. And so in the case of a virus, it's so easy unless you go into kind of draconian measures of quarantine to stop it. It spreads very, very rapidly. Everybody is now everywhere in globalization. Then you throw in communication, you know, obviously the internet and you know, obviously, you know, 24-hour news and things like that. And so you can see where it challenges or it stresses the concept of the nation state, where a lot of times we are very interested in issues that have nothing to do with the United States. It's going on the other side of the world. And so globalization has actually been around for the last 120 or so years when we're talking about, you know, more integrated international trade. In fact, if you kind of really go back, you start looking at some of these voyages of discovery and mercantilism in Europe in the 14th, 15th century. But globalization has become much more intensive, in particular in the modern era, and because of a number of reasons. First of all, there's a difference in degree. The volume of global trade and overseas investment is at an all-time high. It's a difference of speed, again, because of modern telecommunication and banking. It makes thinking and knowledge and transactions virtually instantaneous. It's a difference in scope. Literally, knowledge becomes unprecedented. We've got a world economy, and you saw that in 2008, and I'm sure we're going to see that in what's taking place right now with this coronavirus, where, you know, in 2008, the American banking system basically started collapsing because of a lot of these toxic assets and this bundling of all of these subprime mortgages that happen in the United States. But because we trade with Europe and we trade with Asia and all those types of things, what happened in the United States very quickly traveled over to other countries. Okay, so it's a difference in scope. What affects one part of the globe very quickly affects another part, whether it's positively or negatively. And then another aspect of globalization is what they call simultaneity. In other words, mass knowledge and mass effects happen literally almost all the time overnight or during the same day throughout the world. So again, there's a phrase they use, you maybe have heard of it, it's called glocal or globalization, is that many times what happens locally can happen globally, and what happens globally can happen locally, and it allows everybody to affect everyone because of a lot of the interconnectedness. Another aspect of globalization, if you look at slide number 50, I don't think your textbook talks about this as much, but I'm adding this because I think it's important. We've moved from singular modernity to multiple modernities. No, what is modernity? Okay, we live in a modern world. Let me make it as simple as possible. Modernity is simply this. We get our meaning from the market, and we get our truth from science. That's modernity. Okay? In other words, we live in a modern world where the markets generally determine a lot of what goes on in our daily lives, and we're seeing this as it's been disrupted because of this coronavirus. And we get our truth from science. Again, whereas prior to the modern era, it was much more common for people to get their truth from the church, from Christianity. Okay, and part of the Enlightenment that occurred in the 18th century was a rejection of hierarchy of truth. Is that we don't have truth anymore from the church. We don't have the church anymore from the input of religion. Human reason, autonomous human reason, disconnected from the authority of church and God, is more important. Again, I'm not saying that I agree with that, but that's generally the logic of modernity. Okay, and so we've generally in America have experienced basically the Western civilization concept of modernity. Okay, where a lot of our reasoning comes from Europe and a lot of the Enlightenment and again the American War of Independence and the thinking of Thomas Jefferson, who got a lot of his thinking from John Locke, and Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes. Okay, a lot of that thinking has shifted in the time of globalization. Other countries are getting their meaning from the market and the truth from science and reason. Okay, in Asia or in sections of India. Okay, we've got multiple modernity. We don't just have a European modernity. We've got an Asian modernity. Okay, modernity generally was Western, so globalization was Westernization, Americanization, Coca-Cola inization. Okay, but whereas now we've got all of these other countries coming on board, and so it's going to be really interesting to see what modernity looks like when we don't just have a European form of it. And so again, you can kind of review some of those slides there. I'm going to just skip over here just for the sake of time. But if you look at slide number 53, not every country participates equally in the globalization system. Okay, you take Cuba, which has largely been isolated because of its communistic inclinations. During Obama's administration, he began to soften some of the relations between the United States and Cuba and has allowed more trading to go on. But again, America, ever since Cuba went communist in 1959, has generally tried to isolate the country. And so it's been prevented from entering the international global marketplace. Same thing with North Korea. And again, for rightfully so. You had incredible human rights violations in Cuba that didn't stop because the Obama administrations began to have more relations with Cuba. Still goes on. Same thing with North Korea. So they've been somewhat isolated and edged out. Okay. As far as other aspects of globalization, let's skip ahead to slide number 57. Part of the celebration of globalization is there have been improved conditions in developing countries. Again, I kind of talked a little bit about the downside of globalization. In particular, the coronavirus is revealing what can happen the downside, but there's been some good sides as other countries have been lifted out of poverty because they've participated in global trade, different things have benefited them. In other words, there's increased per capita income, there's decreased poverty, there's increased literacy, there's increased life expectancy, there's been a decrease in child death rates. So there's been some benefits, and again, you can look at the slide on page 58 there. You look at the growth in GDP in various countries that have been embracing global trade. There's been downsides as well with it, and if you look at slide number 60, you can see some of those. The concerns are inequality. Is that basically part of the challenge is, okay, we are embracing international trade, but in order to embrace the benefits of international trade, cheaper products coming in, again, think Walmart, think even Amazon. Okay, a lot of our big retailers sell us cheaper products because we're able to buy them from other countries that can produce them more cheaply than American companies, and perhaps even better sometimes. But that creates offshoring. Okay, in other words, or outsourcing, where we buy products from other countries, we ship or we move American factories over to the Far East or over to Mexico or in other countries where it is much cheaper to buy foreign products. Again, I've been, my family, because my dad worked in the car industry all of his life, I was always taught, and I still have, buy American cars. I've never bought a foreign car. Probably never will, but the dirty little secret is this buy American car that I have sitting out in the parking lot, and I can look out there and see it. Not a stretch to say that probably most of the internal guts of that car, whether it's the engine or the other aspects of that car, was most likely purchased and assembled in another country, and then brought to the United States where some of the final assembly occurred, so you can basically put the little moniker on it, made in America. Okay, in other words, if we didn't offshore or outsource some of the manufacturing of cars in particular, it would probably be very cost prohibitive for most of us to buy certain cars. In other words, we wouldn't be able to afford them, or it'd be double, triple, or I don't even know the exact amount, but it would be many, many times more expensive. So offshoring can be a good thing, but the problem is if we lose jobs, okay? And part of the challenge, and I give you this challenge as an educator, I always sought to try to get as broad an education as possible, okay? So that if I ever lost a job, I would have enough chops, so to speak, or have enough education broadly enough that I could integrate, or I could shift very quickly over to a different field if necessary. In other words, one of the dangers, and again, I don't want to digress too much on a philosophy of education lecture, but one of the dangers of a lot of the specialization in a lot of our educational system is that many individuals get a degree and it's so specialized that if they can't get a job in that particular area, they find that it's very hard pressed to get a job somewhere else. And this is the issue with offshoring or outsourcing, is if you don't have a lot of education, or you don't have the ability to adapt when a company offshores or outsources, it's very hard for people who have lost their jobs to find a comparable job. Okay, so that's part of the controversy of globalization. Okay, one of the other problems of globalization is we privilege economic efficiency. Okay, in other words, we can buy goods a lot cheaper over in, I don't know, say Vietnam, or take some Asian country, okay? But what if we're buying products from a country there that is engaged in some form of human rights violation, okay? Or you buy a lot of product from China. In China, they do not have an environmental protection agency, so it's not uncommon for large cities in China to basically almost become smogged out because they're not dealing with emissions of cars and regulating that, okay? is it worth it for economic efficiency so we can buy cheaper products to degrade the environment in another country, or to buy products from people that are engaged in human rights violations, or they got some sort of sweatshop and they're, we're buying cheap Nike shoes or cheap Nike products, for one example. This has been an argument through the years. But they're doing it at the cost of paying these people basically peanuts, working in very unsafe conditions so we can have cheap shoes or cheap athletic equipment, okay? So in other words, that's a challenge of globalization, okay? And then also political distortion, okay, is this idea that we will privilege, perhaps a nation will privilege an American company or any kind of foreign company coming into that nation that perhaps maybe pays people peanuts or something to that effect. In other words, the nation will favor the foreign company coming in there because they want the tax base and they want the financial resources, but at the expense of exploiting their people. Okay, so there's issues there. So anyway, I'm going to stop there for the sake of time. I'm stopping at slide number 60. Hopefully we'll finish this out with the next video. Take care.